lends their voice to the recording. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Aaron Maté.
Well, with the potential for a ceasefire between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza, we turn now to the roots of the latest crisis and what can be done to avoid another in the future. It is widely thought the flare-up began with the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teens in the West Bank just over a month ago. Their dead bodies were found later on. But our next guests argue the narrative ignores the broader context of decades of occupation and recent events highlighting the expansionist goals of the Israeli government in the Palestinian land under its control.
For more, we're joined by Norman Finkelstein, author and scholar. His most recent books are Old Wine, Broken Bottle, Ari Shavit's Promised Land, and Knowing Too Much, Why the American Jewish Romance with Israel is Coming to an End. And we're joined by Mouin Rabbani, a Palestinian political analyst, formerly with the International Crisis Group. Today, both Norman Finkelstein and Mouin Rabbani have co-authored a forthcoming book, How to Solve the Israel-Palestine Conflict. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Mouin Rabbani, we're speaking to you over at The Hague. Can you respond to this latest news of the Egyptian ceasefire, Israel accepting and Hamas weighing this?
Well, I think Amira explained it quite well. So far as we can tell, Hamas has been neither directly nor indirectly consulted on a proposal that basically the Egyptians have concocted together with Tony Blair and the Israelis and some other parties, the purpose of which appears to be something that Hamas cannot accept and that can then be used to legitimize an intensification of the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip. The problem for Hamas is twofold. On the one hand, as Amira explained, it basically restores an unacceptable status quo, while on the other hand, it has been endorsed by the Arab League, by the PA in Ramallah, by most of the Western powers, and so on. So it'll be difficult for them to either accept or reject it, so to speak, while at the same time, I think the parties that are proposing this ceasefire are making it clear that they're not really interested in any further negotiation of its terms.
Norman Finkelstein, give us a sketch of the broader context for how this latest flare-up began.
Well, before I do, I'm going to just briefly comment on the ceasefire. The ceasefire, first of all, says nothing about the rampages by Israel against Hamas in the West Bank. And it was those rampages which caused the current conflict to escalate. It gives Israel a green light to continue arresting Hamas members, blowing up homes in the West Bank, ransacking homes, and killing Palestinians, which was the prelude to the current fighting. Secondly, if you look at the ceasefire, it's exactly what was agreed on in June 2008, and the same ceasefire that was agreed to in November 2012. Namely, in both cases, it was said that there would be a relaxing of the illegal blockade of Gaza. In both cases, after the ceasefire was signed, the blockade was maintained, and in fact, the blockade was escalated. So now, in the current version of the ceasefire, it said the blockade will be lifted after there has been calm restored and the security situation has been established. But if Israel says Hamas is a terrorist organization, then the security situation can never be calm in the Gaza, and therefore there'll be never a lifting of the blockade of Gaza. So we're right back to where we were in June 2008, November 2012. Of course Hamas is going to reject that kind of agreement. It means it legalizes, it legitimizes the brutal, merciless, heartless, illegal blockade of Gaza. As to how we got to where we are, the general context is perfectly obvious for anyone who wants to see it. A unity government was formed between the PA and Hamas. Netanyahu was enraged at this unity government. It called on the U.S., it called on the EU to break relations with the Palestinian Authority. Surprisingly, the United States said no. We're going to give this unity government time. We'll see whether it works or not. Then the EU came in and said, it will also give the unity government time. Let's see what happens. At this point, Netanyahu virtually went berserk, and he was determined to break up the unity government. when there was the abduction of the 3 Israeli teenagers, he found his pretext. There isn't a scratch of evidence, not a jot of evidence that Hamas had anything to do with the kidnappings and the killings. Nobody even knows what the motive was to this point. Even if you look at the July 3rd report of the Human Rights Watch, they said nobody knows who was behind the abductions. Even the U.S. State Department, on July 7th, there was a news conference, and the U.S. State Department said we don't have hard evidence about who was responsible. But that had nothing to do with it. It was just a pretext. The pretext was to go into the West Bank, attack Hamas, arrest 700 members of Hamas, blow up 2 homes, carry on these rampages, these ransackings, and to try to evoke a reaction from Hamas. This is what Israel always does. Anybody who knows the history, it's what the Israeli political scientist, the mainstream political scientist, his name was Avner Yaniv. He said it's these Palestinian peace offensives. Whenever the Palestinians seem like they are trying to reach a settlement of the conflict, which the unity government was, at that point, Israel does everything it can to provoke a violent reaction, in this case from Hamas, break up the unity government, and Israel has its pretext. We can't negotiate with the Palestinian Authority because they only represent some of the Palestinian people. They don't represent all of the Palestinian people. And so Netanyahu does what he always does, what Israeli governments always do. You keep pounding the Palestinians, in this case pounding Hamas, trying to evoke a reaction, and when the reaction comes, when the reaction comes, you say, we can't deal with these people, they're terrorists.
Mouin Rabbani, on this issue of the Israeli teens who were kidnapped and then killed, when did the Israeli government understand that they had been murdered as they carried out the siege to try to find them?
Well, what we know is that one of these youths called the police emergency line immediately after they were abducted, and that gunshots can be clearly heard on the recording of that telephone conversation. On that basis, the Israeli security establishment concluded that the 3 youths had been killed almost as soon as they were abducted, and this information was, of course, known to the Israeli government. Nevertheless, Netanyahu deliberately suppressed this information using the broad censorship powers that the Israeli government has, and during this period launched into this organized
put a gag order on reporters from reporting this?
Basically, yes. That this was treated as sensitive security information subject to military censorship, and there were only allusions to it, and only days after, by some Israeli journalists, and then only referring to some elliptical statements that were being made by Israeli military commanders, suggesting that this is not a hostage rescue situation as Netanyahu is presenting it, but is more likely to be a search for bodies, which is, of course, how it turned out. And the reason that Netanyahu suppressed this information is because it gave him the opportunity to launch this organized rampage throughout the West Bank, to start rearresting prisoners who had been released in 2011, the prisoner exchange between Hamas and Israel, to intensify the bombing of the Gaza Strip, and generally to whip up mass hysteria within Israel, which of course resulted in the burning death of the 16-year-old Palestinian from Jerusalem several days later.